Hello and welcome back. This video is about New Systems Instruments, which in my book is one of the most innovative and underrated brands in Eurorack. I'll be looking at 4 of their modules: the Harmonic Shift Oscillator, which is a unique analog VCO, Inertia, which is a universal movement simulator that can be anything from an envelope to a filter depending on how you patch it, Babel, which is a one-of-a-kind analog logic and intermodulation utility, and the new Quad LFO, which is, well, basically 4 LFOs, but even this one offers some less common features via the phase expander. Now, when I first encountered the brand, I have to admit I was a bit intimidated by the slightly academic aesthetic. The manuals and website are undeniably excellent and very thorough, but they're quite heavy on graphs and equations. The thing that really struck me once I dug in, though, was how elegantly simple these modules are. Powerful, multifunctional devices with no menus or shift keys, just one knob per function. Still blows my mind that the Harmonic Shift Oscillator offers such a wide sonic spectrum with essentially 2 key controls, and Inertia can be dozens of things with just 4 parameters. Their whole approach just really clicks with me as a fan of modern analog synthesis that looks beyond the established paradigms. What I'm not going to do in this video is go too deep into the theory side, mainly because the maths can be pretty complex and the manuals do a much better job of explaining it than I would. I do think understanding a bit about the underlying principles will help you get the most out of the modules, but they're also very intuitive to use, and you don't need to be a scientist to start getting useful and unique sounds out of them. So instead I'm going to focus on practical applications, and I'll demonstrate some ways you might use the modules to make actual music. I'll give a quick overview of each module before I get stuck into the patches, so feel free to use the timing index to skip around. I should also point out that I bought Babel myself a little while ago, but Signal Sounds, who distribute these modules, very kindly provided me with the others to make this video. No one has told me what to say though, so the opinions are 100% mine. Anyway, let's crack on. Let's start with a look at the Harmonic Shift Oscillator. Now this is a 12 HP module, fairly simple on the surface, not too many controls, but there's some pretty complex stuff happening under the hood. On the left we've got the tuning controls, the conventional coarse and fine tuning. There's an FM input with an attenuator, and there's a volt per octave input. There are 2 outputs, a main output and a secondary output that's 90 degrees out of phase with the first. That could be useful for stereo or spatialization effects, and you could also use that for self-patching into the FM input, for example. The real meat of the oscillator is this harmonic section, which has 2 controls, level and stride. Now the way this works, it's kind of a bit like an additive oscillator in that it's based around a sine wave core, and harmonics are added with these controls. It's not adding, in a conventional additive sense, adding individual sine wave partials, but it's adding harmonics to that sine wave. Stride controls the spacing of the harmonics, so at various values of stride they will be integer multiples of that core frequency, which will sound harmonic and give you waves that sound a bit like saws and triangles and squares. In between you'll get this kind of inharmonic spectrum, which can be really cool for percussion and effects sounds. Harmonic level controls the relative level of the upper frequencies that are added, or the upper harmonics that are added rather. The higher the level control, the higher the relative level of the upper harmonics and the brighter the sound. So you can think about the harmonic level as controlling the brightness and harmonic stride as controlling the spectrum. Let's have a listen. This is the sine wave on its own with nothing happening. That's the conventional coarse tuning and fine. And let's just bring the harmonic level up to about 2/3 and we'll sweep through the stride, and I'll stop at the sweet spots where the stride are integer values which will give us harmonic sounds. So at the moment that's kind of a sine wave. Let's just sweep up. That's a value of 0.5, which is still in tune because there's a slightly more harmonically rich sound. And as we approach 12 o'clock we get another one. Kind of saw-like, and then as we keep going, there's another, and another, and another. Now it's hard to tune into all these exactly, but you that's part of the fun. You get these waves that are always moving around a little bit. Let's just bring it back to this slightly square, and I'll just demo the effect of the level. As we increase the level it gets brighter, and as we decrease it gets softer. Now of course we've got CV inputs for both of these with attenuators, and the real fun with this module comes when you modulate these. I find that modulating the harmonic level is great for your kind of conventional filtery kind of effects. Modulating stride can be really good for more atonal, techno kind of sounds, and also for percussion. Modulating those with envelopes can give some really great results. Okay, next up is Inertia, which is a slightly more difficult module to explain than the Harmonic Shift Oscillator, but I'm going to give it a go. It's a 14 HP module, and fundamentally at its heart, it's a kind of slew limiter. Inspired by the Surge DUSG, the dual universal slope generator, that was also the inspiration for Make Noise Maths. It's a single channel of that. Has a feature of its own called momentum, which kind of sets it apart from anything else out there, which I'll come on to in a second. Now, a slew limiter basically gives you a rate-limited output signal from a given input signal. What that means is it will slow down the rate of the rise and the rate of the fall of that signal. So if you were using a pitch sequence, for example, you could use a slew limiter to add portamento, to add glide between notes. If you were feeding in an audio rate signal, you can use it as a filter. You can take the edge off those, the edges of a square wave, for example, and make it something that's a bit closer to a triangle. So there's various ways you can use a slew limiter. It's an incredibly powerful module, one of the real basic building blocks of modular. What Inertia has, which no other slew limiter has that I'm aware of, is this momentum feature, which basically gives the output signal a tendency to continue in the direction of travel, overshoot, and then settle. So you can get these kind of bounces on the envelope. You can get these kind of woggles in between pitches. Let me show you how it sounds with... This is a square wave which I'm just using to control the pitch of an oscillator. I've attenuated and offset this square wave so it's roughly jumping on octaves. And at the moment I'm just running the signal through. I've got the rate set to maximum for the rise and fall, and I've got no momentum at all. If I just bring these rates down slightly, you'll hear it slowing down that signal so it's kind of gliding up to the peak and gliding down again. Now if I add a bit of momentum to this, which I'll do both simultaneously, you can hear it's kind of overshooting and wobbling and settling back down again, and as you get more and more momentum, you get this quite extreme version of that square wave input which has all these kind of wiggles in it. So this is probably a good time to talk about the controls. There are basically only 4 controls on Inertia. They each have a CV input with an attenuverter, and they let you control the rise and fall rate and the rise and fall momentum. And there's a switch here, this interface switch, that gives you 2 different ways to kind of view those through these 4 knobs. In the standard rise-fall mode, these 2 knobs control the rise rate and the fall rate, and these 2 knobs control the momentum for the rise and the momentum for the fall. If you switch to the skew mode with the blue LED, then the first knob controls the overall rate of both the rise and the fall, and then the second knob controls the skew between them. And likewise, in the momentum section, the first knob will control the overall momentum of both rise and fall, and then the skew will control the balance between them, or the skew from one to the other. You've also got a low and high frequency operation mode, so low is for kind of envelopes, LFOs, high is for oscillators and filters. You've got a signal input, a trigger input for triggering envelopes, if you're going to use it as an envelope generator, and a volt per octave input when you're using it as an oscillator. We've got a first order output and a second order output, the second order output being a little smoother than the first, and if you're using it as a filter, the first order is 6 dB per octave and the second order is 12 dB per octave. And that's kind of it control-wise, but like I say, you can use it as an oscillator, as an LFO, as a filter, as an envelope generator. And using a combination of momentum and these different control modes, you can do stuff that is really difficult to do with any other conventional function generator or slew limiter. And I'll come to some of those in the patches. Just as a very quick example, I'll put it into oscillator mode. So if we flick the interface to skew mode, the range to high, I'm just taking the first order output. I've got the rate and skew controls both set to 12 o'clock. If we maximize the momentum, that causes it to self-oscillate in this sine wave. This first rate control controls the frequency, and the volt per octave input will affect the tuning of that. So you can play it like a conventional oscillator, and the skew here will skew the shape of the wave, where the rising edge is slower and the falling edge is very fast. And likewise if you go the other direction. You notice there's a lot more pitch drift if you go anti-clockwise, whereas if you go clockwise, the pitch stays stable. That's just the nature of the design. You can basically skew in this direction without affecting the pitch, without affecting it too much. But if you go anti-clockwise, the pitch drops. Another thing to watch is if you are using it as an envelope generator, which you would do with the range in low and the interface set to the rise fall, and you would just hit it with a trigger, and then the rise and fall would control the rise and the attack and decay portion of the envelope. The thing that caught me out at first was this is rate rather than time. So to get a short envelope or a short attack time, you need to have the rate at maximum. Normally on an envelope you'd have the attack at minimum, but in this case you'd have the rate at max. And likewise, to increase the decay time, you would turn the full rate anti-clockwise for a longer and longer decay. And finally, before I get into the patches, I'm just going to run through quickly the Quad LFO and its expander and Babel and its expander. Quad LFO is the latest module from New Systems Instruments, and it's probably the simplest one that I'm going to be looking at today. It is, as the name implies, 4 LFOs. You can select wire jumper on the rear panel, whether each one is a sine wave or a square wave shape. There's an FM input for each one, so you've got CV control over the rate. You've got front panel control knob here for the rate with the orange LED to give you a bit of visual feedback. And the way the expander works is you can connect up to 4 of these, one to each of the LFOs on the main unit. I've got this one connected to LFO 4. And it essentially gives you 3 additional sine wave LFOs which are oscillating at the same rate as whichever one you're connecting it to, but you have control over the phase of each one. So you can, with them all at 12 o'clock, they're all 90 degrees out of phase, which gives you a kind of quadrature LFO. But you can use these knobs to adjust the relative phases, which can be useful for rhythmic modulation. You can, for example, have one of the LFOs on the main unit set to be a square wave, effectively a clock, and then you'll have 3 LFOs which are rhythmically tied to that, but which you can adjust the phase of. Really useful. So Babel's the module I've had for the longest. It's kind of an interesting mix of analog logic and intermodulation. The main unit's 6 HP wide with 3 inputs, but you can also add this expander. You can add multiple of these expanders, in fact, which give you another 7 inputs each time. Only 2 HP wide. Really opens it up if you want to get really complex modulation going on. To use it as an analog logic module, you would feed gates into it. The any output will be high if any of the ins are high, so it's like a logical OR. The all output will be high if all of the ins are high, so it's like a logical AND. And the XSUM will be high if some but not all of them are high, so it's like a XOR in traditional logic. It gets quite interesting when you start using it to combine audio rate or modulation signals. Again, you can feed in as many of these as you've got inputs for. Any will give you the maximum value, all will give you the minimum value, and XSUM will give you the balance middle value, and you can adjust that balance middle point with the value control and a corresponding CV input. Gives you, with audio rate tones, it gives you something that's a bit like ring modulation and a bit like wavefolding, a bit more harmonic than ring modulating. It's kind of unique. I've not really got anything quite like it, and you'll hear it a bit later in the video. Okay, to get us going, I'm going to patch up Harmonic Shift Oscillator as a fairly conventional kind of melodic synth voice. I've got the Beat Step Pro set up as a sequencer, which is feeding pitch into the volt per octave, and the gate from the sequencer is going into Inertia to trigger an AD envelope. That's opening the Expert Sleeper's Persephone VCA. And at the moment, with no harmonics from the oscillator, just a pure sine wave, it sounds like this. Now, if I take a copy of that same AD envelope and feed that to the harmonic level input, the CV input of the oscillator, I can introduce a bit of this harmonic stride, which is tuned in, which gives us this kind of enveloped filter on a saw wave kind of effect. It's slightly different, and remember there's no filter in the chain here, it's just the oscillator with its spectrum being varied by the envelope. Let's just play a little sequence. Now the other thing I've done to kind of add a bit of variety is I've taken every note trigger is firing R&D step, which is giving us a random unipolar voltage, which I'm feeding into Dur Analogue's compared to, which will, on occasional notes, depending on that random voltage, give us a gate or not. And then that gate I'm feeding into the harmonic stride input, which I've attenuated to basically jump between 2 possible values for the harmonic stride. Have a listen. So it's kind of switching between a squarish and a sawish wave, both of which are having their harmonic level modulated in real time with the envelope, so it sounds like a filter closing. And you get this nice kind of FM style, quite Detroity, techno kind of bass sound. Let's add some drums. I've also got a little bit of the R&D step random voltage going to control the decay time of the envelope, just a little smidge of that just to vary the decay time of some of the notes. Let's add some chords. And I'm just using one of the LFOs from the Quad LFO to modulate the brightness on rings, which is playing the chords. So a very simple patch, but the harmonic shift oscillator really works great as a kind of main bass tone. Remember, there's no wavefolding, no FM, no filtering going on. It's all coming straight out of the oscillator with a little bit of enveloping of that harmonic level and toggling of the two harmonic stride values. Okay, here's a really simple patch that uses Inertia as a voltage-controlled oscillator. I've got a sequence coming in from the key step 37. The gates from that are triggering an AD envelope in stages, which is opening the Persephone VCA. And at the moment, Inertia is just oscillating as a pure sine wave with the skew in the center. If I adjust that skew, you'll remember it will morph it over towards a more sawtooth-shaped wave without changing the pitch. Now I've got a copy of that same envelope that's opening the VCA, and if I bring that into the skew modulation input, all of a sudden we've got a kind of filtered sawtooth kind of effect. Now remember, there's no filter in the chain here, this is just Inertia going straight into the VCA. So we've already got a really nice kind of filter effect just with that modulation of the skew, which we can adjust as we like. Let's keep it fairly sharp like that. I'm just going to add a little bit of delay and reverb. And another thing we can do, I find the Inertia responds really well to a subtle amount of FM on the frequency input as well. So let's use Harmonic Shift Oscillator for that, because that's not doing anything here. Just as a pure sine wave at the moment, I'm going to take a copy of the same pitch information into the volt per octave, so it's going to track it the same. And if I bring this up a smidgen, it will adjust the tuning a bit, but we can dial in a nice fine tuning. Just gives it a little bit more grit. There's a few sweet spots if you kind of dial in the amount. These really nice waves that sound much more alive than just a standard analog VCO kind of tone. So I'm going to build up a little drone patch that uses the Harmonic Shift Oscillator running through Inertia, acting as a low-pass filter. That is also running through the scope into the Persephone VCA from Expert Sleepers and into the Music Thing Spring Reverb, which is dry at the moment. Now I've got the Quad LFO, I've got LFO 4 set to square mode on the back. That's being used as a clock for the mutable stages, which is basically just sending a 4-step sequence to the harmonic stride input on the Harmonic Shift Oscillator. So that's basically giving us these different harmonics which are changing regularly. And if we just start building up some other bits of modulation, we can get this patch sounding quite complex quite quickly. So I've got the LFO phase expander connected to LFO 4, which is giving us 3 sine LFOs, which I can adjust the phase of, which are all clocked to the same clock as that master sequence there. I'm going to run those 3 through Babel, and I'm going to use that to modulate the harmonic level. I'm going to take them through the any output first of all, which is the maximum, and you can hear the effect of adjusting these phases on the rhythm, especially at this kind of tempo. It's quite obvious what's going on with these. So I'm actually going to slow this down. I'm going to take the X sum output instead, which is the balanced middle of those 3 LFO values, and I'm then going to take another LFO from the top of the Quad LFO to modulate that X sum CV, which gives us a more complex changing rhythm, which is modulating that. Now I'm running it through Inertia as a filter, which is wide open at the moment. Let's just bring that filter cutoff down. I'm taking it from the second order output, which is a 12 dB per octave slope, and let's bring in a bit of resonance via the momentum. And we've got a couple of LFOs we're not using, so let's take one into the cutoff CV and the other one into the cutoff skew, which will kind of change the character of the filter. It'll make it respond differently to the rising and falling edges of the input wave, giving us some quite complex filtering, and especially if we then CV that skew. And let's just drop this down in pitch a bit. And let's distort it a bit through Persephone. And let's add a bit of spring. We've got this nice dark, complex, evolving drone with very complex waveform. Really making the best use of all these LFOs we've got here to modulate the hell out of this patch. So here's a patch with the Harmonic Shift Oscillator being FM'd by Inertia acting as an oscillator, using the FM input on Harmonic Shift Oscillator, and I'm using Inertia as a sine wave VCO. They're both being fed the same pitches from the same sequence in the BeatStep Pro. That's also triggering an envelope, which is opening the Persephone VCA. I've got the Inertia's pitch sequence going through the Tessitura-Taylor octave switch, which can give us a nice few variations on that tone. So it's an exponential FM input, and there are some sweet spots you can dial in, but there's also quite a lot of chaos in between. So I'm just going to have a little play around and let you hear some of the... try and dial in some of the sweet spots, but it might get a little bit chaotic. Also, just to say, you can adjust the wave shapes of both the carrier and the oscillator for even more interesting results as well. At the moment, the inertia is just a sine, but if I wave shape that through to... that's closer to the saw shape, it changes the character a little bit. That's back to the sine again. And if we adjust the Harmonic Shift Oscillator harmonic level as well, I've got the stride dialed into a relatively harmonic interval. I've got a little bit of random modulation of that coming in via the R&D step. That's also playing with the decay time of the envelope as well, just for a bit of variety. But let's just try adjusting the core frequency of the inertia. You can find these kind of sympathetic frequency ratios that sound quite harmonic, and there's chaos in between. And likewise, by adjusting the frequency CV input here, the depth of that modulation, at the extremes it gets very chaotic. Great for effects, but if you want something a bit more musical, dial it down a notch. In this patch I'm going to look at using Babel to create some more complex shifting waves from a couple of fairly simple inputs. So I've got Inertia set up as a VCO again. This is somewhere between a sine and a saw at the moment, just a kind of static wave from there. And I've got a Harmonic Shift Oscillator tuned to the same, and this is tuned to this harmonic, which is about as close as I can get it to a static wave. It's a very kind of slowly shifting, squarish kind of wave. So let's feed both of them into Babel and listen to the X sum output, which is the kind of balanced middle of the two values that are being fed into it. And because we've got a bit of movement in the Harmonic Shift Oscillator wave, we've got a nice bit of movement here. And if I adjust the value on Babel, I can adjust what that kind of middle is taken, whereabouts that middle is taken in between those two waves. So we've got a nice rich, complex wave out of those two. Let's get a bit more modulation happening. Let's take an LFO to that balanced middle value in Babel. Let's take another one to the harmonic level in the Harmonic Shift Oscillator. Got all these LFOs running quite slowly. And let's take a third one to that skew on Inertia. So that wave is now morphing between a kind of more sine and a more aggressive saw. We've got this much more harmonically rich wave now coming out of Babel. I'm feeding it through the AI LPG here. I'm just running the arpeggiator. So with this modulation happening, we've got this really nice evolving tone through the LPG. I've also got the pitch information going into Harmonic Shift Oscillator running through the Tessitura Taylor from Shackmat, which is like an octave switcher, so I can, by tuning it in octaves, you get these quite nice range of tones as well. Very FM style, slightly wavefoldery. So that's about it for this video. I hope the patches are giving you a bit of a flavour of what these modules are capable of. I've kind of barely scratched the surface with some of them. There's so much more to explore with Inertia in particular that I think I'm going to have to do a deep dive on that one at a future time. In the meantime, if you're interested in the theory, then I'd definitely recommend you check out the New Systems Instruments website and check out the articles and the manuals for the stuff there that Evan's written. It's really superb. Overall, I think if you're looking for modules that do something a little bit different from the norm, if you're a fan of that kind of experimental analog design that brands like Analogue have become known for, these will be right up your street. The build quality is fantastic, they look really cool, everything about them kind of reeks of quality. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, leave it a thumbs up and give me a subscribe, tell your friends. I'll be back soon with more, and in the meantime, thanks for watching.